We witness today a peculiar phenomenon that would have been incomprehensible to our ancestors. Politicians speak endlessly of solutions while the problems multiply exponentially. Programs are proposed with scientific precision, policies implemented with bureaucratic efficiency, yet the fundamental disorder deepens with each passing year. Why does this occur? Because we have forgotten the elementary truth that political order reflects the order of the soul. Every political crisis is first a crisis of consciousness, a deformation in how human beings experience reality itself. When consciousness becomes disordered, when men lose their proper orientation toward transcendent truth, political arrangements inevitably follow this spiritual descent into chaos. The current fragmentation of Western institutions is not accidental, it mirrors the fragmentation of modern consciousness, which has systematically expelled the transcendent dimension from its horizon of experience. The riots in our streets, the breakdown of civil discourse, the corruption of educational institutions, the polarization that tears families apart, these are not isolated phenomena but symptoms of a deeper malady. They manifest the spiritual condition of persons who have lost contact with the ordering experiences that make authentic political community possible. Today we shall examine this fundamental connection between consciousness and political order, revealing why no external reform can succeed without addressing the deeper spiritual crisis that produces our political maladies. Chapter 1: The Essential Structure of Ordered Consciousness. To understand political disorder, we must first grasp what constitutes ordered consciousness, a task that requires us to think beyond the shallow categories that dominate contemporary discourse. Human consciousness is not a closed system generating its own meanings, nor is it a passive receptor of environmental stimuli. Rather, it exists in perpetual tension between temporal existence and eternal truth. This tension is not a problem to be solved but the very structure of human reality, what I call the metaxy, the in-between condition of human existence. Ordered consciousness experiences itself as participating in a reality that transcends material existence while remaining grounded in historical circumstances. The person of ordered consciousness knows himself as neither pure spirit nor mere matter, but as existing in the luminous tension between these poles. This tension generates both humility and responsibility. Humility because we recognize our limitations and dependence on truth that we do not create. Responsibility because we participate in divine order and must respond to its demands. Such consciousness naturally produces political arrangements that reflect this fundamental structure. Authority is understood as service to transcendent truth rather than arbitrary power exercised for its own sake. Laws emerge from the recognition of objective moral order rather than mere human convention or the will of the stronger. Citizens participate in political life not as atomized individuals pursuing private interests in a marketplace of competing desires, but as persons conscious of their common orientation toward truth and justice. The classical polis exemplified this understanding in its highest moments. For Aristotle, political community existed for the sake of the good life, not mere survival or material prosperity. Citizens participated in deliberation about justice because they shared a common consciousness of man's orientation toward the divine. Even when they disagreed about particular policies, they maintained agreement about the transcendent framework within which political questions should be considered. The polis was educational, it formed character through participation in the search for justice. This ordered consciousness manifests certain recognizable characteristics that distinguish it from its deformed alternatives. First, there is openness to questioning, the recognition that human knowledge is limited and that truth must be sought through patient investigation rather than ideological assertion. Second, there is reverence for truth as something discovered rather than created, received rather than constructed. Third, there is acceptance of mystery, the recognition that existence contains dimensions that exceed human comprehension and control. Fourth, there is commitment to the common good understood not as the aggregation of private interests but as participation in divine order that encompasses and judges all particular arrangements. When these elements flourish in a community, political arrangements naturally tend toward justice and stability. Citizens trust one another because they share fundamental orientations. Authority is accepted because it serves transcendent purposes. Law is respected because it embodies wisdom rather than arbitrary will. When these elements atrophy, political order begins its inevitable descent toward the various forms of disorder that characterize our contemporary situation. The tragedy of our time is that these fundamental experiences have been systematically obscured by intellectual and spiritual formations that deny their reality or reduce them to psychological projections, social constructions, or evolutionary adaptations. We have been taught to be suspicious of precisely those experiences that make authentic political community possible. Chapter 2: The Gnostic Deformation and its Political Consequences. Modern political crises emerge from a fundamental deformation of consciousness that I have termed Gnostic, not merely an intellectual error but an existential rebellion against the structure of reality itself. This deformation represents one of the most dangerous spiritual diseases that can afflict human consciousness, and understanding its structure is essential for anyone who wishes to resist its corrupting influence on political life. Gnostic consciousness refuses to accept the tension of human existence that I described as the metaxy. It demands instead perfect knowledge and complete control over historical circumstances. The Gnostic believes he possesses special insight into the meaning of history and the structure of reality that allows him to transcend the limitations that constrain ordinary human beings. Unlike the person of ordered consciousness who accepts the mystery of existence and his own participation in it, the Gnostic claims to have penetrated this mystery and discovered the secret of transforming the world into a realm of perfect order and justice. This is what I call the immanentization of the escheaton, the attempt to realize ultimate perfection within historical time through human action. The Gnostic takes the legitimate human longing for transcendence and corrupts it by claiming that transcendent perfection can be achieved through political means. Instead of accepting that ultimate fulfillment lies beyond history, he promises to create heaven on earth through the implementation of his superior knowledge. This deformation manifests in various forms throughout modernity, each sharing the same essential structure despite surface differences. Progressive ideologies promise to eliminate suffering and establish perfect equality through scientific social engineering. Revolutionary movements claim to have discovered the laws of history and can therefore guarantee the triumph of justice over oppression. Even liberal individualism, apparently modest in its claims, contains Gnostic elements when it assumes that proper institutional arrangements can eliminate the fundamental tensions and tragic dimensions of human existence. The Gnostic consciousness produces characteristic political pathologies that we can observe operating in contemporary society. Since perfect knowledge is claimed, dissent becomes not merely disagreement among fallible human beings but evidence of moral corruption or false consciousness that must be eliminated. Since the goal is ultimate transformation, any means become justified by the transcendent end, the good cause sanctifies even evil actions. Since the movement possesses absolute truth, opposition represents forces of darkness that must be defeated rather than fellow seekers who might contribute to our understanding. We see this pattern repeatedly throughout modern history: the French Revolution's terror, communist purges, fascist eliminationism, and contemporary cancel culture all follow the same basic structure. When consciousness becomes convinced of its own perfection and the perfectibility of the world through political action, politics becomes a crusade against the unregenerate rather than a search for justice among fallible human beings who share common humanity despite their disagreements. The tragedy is that Gnostic consciousness, in its very attempt to create perfect order, destroys the conditions that make genuine order possible. By refusing to accept the limitations of human knowledge and power, it creates systems that must rely on coercion rather than persuasion, propaganda rather than truth, manipulation rather than education, and ultimately violence rather than justice. The promise of liberation becomes the reality of enslavement, as we have seen repeatedly in the totalitarian experiments of the 20th century. Most insidiously, Gnostic consciousness immunizes itself against correction by interpreting all criticism as evidence of the critic's spiritual corruption. This creates what I call the intellectual swindle, a systematic distortion of reality that cannot be corrected through rational argument because it has defined rationality itself in terms of agreement with its premises. Chapter 3: The Formation of Ideological Consciousness in Modern Society. The Gnostic deformation has crystallized in modernity into what we must recognize as ideological consciousness, a particular way of experiencing reality that systematically distorts our understanding of human existence and political order. This is not simply a matter of holding incorrect opinions that can be corrected through better information, but rather the formation of consciousness structures that make genuine political discourse impossible by eliminating the conditions necessary for authentic inquiry. Ideological consciousness differs fundamentally from both classical philosophy and genuine religious experience because it closes itself off from questioning and reduces the fullness of reality to a system of concepts that can be manipulated for political purposes. It represents what we might call the second reality, an artificial construction that claims to be more real than the reality of immediate experience. Consider carefully how you experience political discussions in contemporary society. Notice how rarely participants engage in genuine inquiry about the nature of justice, the good life, or the proper ordering of human community. Instead, they deploy predetermined positions like weapons, employ emotional manipulation rather than rational argument, and refuse to acknowledge the complexity and mystery of human existence. This is not accidental ignorance that can be remedied through education, but the systematic result of consciousness that has been formed by ideological structures that make authentic political philosophy impossible. Ideological consciousness operates through what I call intellectual swindles, the systematic misrepresentation of reality to serve political purposes. These swindles take various forms that have become so familiar we often fail to recognize their destructive character. There is the reduction of human nature to economic interests, as if persons were merely productive and consuming units rather than beings oriented toward transcendent truth. There is the treatment of cultural traditions as arbitrary constructions that can be discarded and reconstructed according to contemporary preferences, rather than repositories of wisdom accumulated through generations of human experience. There is the denial of transcendent truth in favor of power relations, as if all claims to knowledge were merely disguised attempts at domination rather than genuine responses to reality. The most dangerous aspect of ideological consciousness is its tendency to present partial truths as complete systems of explanation. Marxism correctly identifies economic alienation and the reality of class conflict, but reduces all human experience to material relations of production. Liberalism rightly values individual dignity and freedom, but often ignores the social and spiritual conditions necessary for persons to flourish in community. Nationalism appropriately recognizes the importance of cultural identity and historical continuity, but frequently degenerates into tribal hatred and the worship of collective power. Each ideology contains enough truth to attract intelligent adherents while remaining systematically closed to aspects of reality that would challenge its fundamental premises. This creates what I term the eclipse of reality, the loss of contact with the full range of human experience in favor of artificially constructed intellectual systems that claim to explain everything but actually explain nothing essential about the human condition. The political consequences are devastating for any society that allows ideological consciousness to dominate its public discourse. When consciousness becomes ideological, political discourse loses its connection to truth and becomes merely a struggle for power between competing systems of manipulation. Citizens are no longer persons seeking justice together despite their disagreements, but members of ideological tribes seeking dominance over their enemies. The common good disappears as a meaningful concept because there is no shared understanding of human nature or transcendent purpose that could serve as a standard for political judgment. This explains the current polarization that characterizes political life in Western societies, it is not simply a matter of policy disagreements but reflects the deeper fragmentation of consciousness itself. Chapter 4: The Historical Trajectory from Order to Disorder. The consciousness crisis underlying our political disorder did not emerge overnight but represents the culmination of a long historical process that began in the late medieval period and accelerated dramatically during what historians call the Enlightenment. Understanding this development is crucial for grasping both the depth of our current predicament and the possibilities for recovery, because it reveals that our situation is not the inevitable result of progress but the consequence of specific spiritual and intellectual choices that could have been made differently. The medieval synthesis, whatever its limitations and imperfections, maintained the essential tension between temporal and eternal order that makes authentic political community possible. Political authority was understood as participation in divine authority rather than arbitrary human will. Law reflected natural law grounded in divine reason rather than mere convention or the preferences of the powerful. Human persons were understood as oriented toward transcendent truth rather than confined to material existence. This synthesis provided a framework within which political questions could be meaningfully debated because participants shared fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and human purpose. This synthesis began to fracture when nominalist philosophy denied the reality of universal concepts, reducing them to mere names imposed on chaotic particulars. This seemingly abstract philosophical development had profound political consequences because it undermined the intellectual foundations of natural law theory and opened the way for voluntarist theories of political authority based on will rather than reason. The Renaissance witnessed the emergence of what we might call humanistic Gnosticism, the belief that human reason could achieve complete understanding of reality without reference to transcendent truth or divine revelation. This development reached its culmination in the Enlightenment, which systematically excluded transcendent experience from the realm of legitimate knowledge while maintaining naive confidence in reason's ability to solve all human problems through the application of scientific method to political and social questions. The French Revolution represents the first full-scale attempt to implement Gnostic consciousness in political practice on a national scale. The revolutionaries claimed to have discovered the rational principles of perfect social organization and proceeded to destroy traditional institutions in favor of their constructed alternatives. When reality refused to conform to their rational blueprints, when human beings continued to behave in ways that contradicted revolutionary theory, they resorted to terror against the enemies of reason. The guillotine became the instrument for eliminating the recalcitrant reality that refused to conform to ideological expectations. The 19th century witnessed the proliferation of secular salvation movements, socialism, nationalism, positivism, scientism, anarchism, each claiming to possess the key to historical transformation through the application of scientific knowledge to social problems. These movements shared the fundamental Gnostic structure despite their surface differences: claims to special knowledge about the meaning of history, confidence in historical necessity that would guarantee their triumph, and the promise of imminent perfection through political action guided by superior understanding. The 20th century revealed the full horror of Gnostic politics in the totalitarian movements that murdered over 100 million people in their attempts to create perfect societies. Yet we have failed to learn the essential lesson that these catastrophes were not accidental aberrations or temporary departures from the path of progress, but the logical culmination of consciousness structures that remain operative in contemporary society. Today's political crises, the breakdown of institutional authority, the polarization of public discourse, the reduction of citizens to demographic categories competing for government benefits, the substitution of activism for contemplation, the treatment of political opponents as enemies to be destroyed rather than fellow citizens with whom we disagree, all follow the same pattern of consciousness that produced the catastrophes of the previous century. The tragedy is that each generation believes itself to be more enlightened than its predecessors while repeating the same fundamental errors in new forms. We have not transcended the Gnostic temptation but have simply found new ways to express it through technologies and institutions that amplify its destructive potential. Chapter 5: Diagnostic Criteria for Recognizing Gnostic Politics. The Gnostic structure of consciousness manifests in contemporary political life through patterns that, once recognized, become unmistakable markers of spiritual disorder. Learning to identify these patterns is essential for anyone seeking to resist the spiritual disorder that produces political chaos, and the capacity for such recognition represents a crucial form of intellectual and spiritual self-defense in our disordered age. First, observe carefully how contemporary political movements promise perfect solutions to complex human problems that have persisted throughout history. Climate activism claims that proper policies will restore harmony between humanity and nature, eliminating the environmental problems that result from the fundamental tension between human needs and natural limits. Social justice movements promise to eliminate inequality and oppression through correct ideology and institutional reforms, as if the tragic dimensions of human existence could be legislated away. Economic theories guarantee prosperity and security through adherence to their principles, whether these be free market mechanisms or socialist planning. Each displays the classic Gnostic confidence in human ability to achieve perfection through knowledge and action. Second, notice the characteristic treatment of opposition in contemporary political discourse. Disagreement is rarely understood as honest difference of opinion among fallible human beings seeking truth together despite their limitations and biases. Instead, opposition represents moral corruption, false consciousness, or allegiance to evil forces that must be eliminated rather than persuaded. This explains the contemporary phenomenon of deplatforming, cancellation, and the general refusal to engage with opposing viewpoints through rational argument. When you possess absolute truth about the direction of history, dialogue becomes unnecessary and potentially corrupting. It might introduce doubts that would interfere with the purity of revolutionary commitment. Third, examine carefully the role of expertise in contemporary political life. Technical knowledge has replaced wisdom as the criterion for authority, while wisdom itself has been dismissed as subjective preference or cultural prejudice. Economists predict market behavior with mathematical precision while being consistently wrong about major developments. Social scientists claim to understand human nature while producing theories that reduce persons to statistical abstractions manipulated by environmental forces. Medical authorities assert control over personal choices while ignoring the full range of considerations relevant to human flourishing. Educational experts design curricula that produce graduates incapable of thinking about fundamental questions. This represents a fundamental category error that pervades modern consciousness, the confusion of technical manipulation with genuine knowledge of human existence. The Gnostic consciousness believes that quantifiable data can capture the mystery of human existence and that proper technique can solve existential problems that by their nature transcend technical solutions. Fourth, consider how contemporary movements relate to historical time and cultural tradition. Rather than understanding themselves as participating in traditions that extend beyond their temporal existence and contribute to their formation, they claim to represent complete breaks with the past. Each generation promises to be the first to achieve authentic existence, perfect justice, or genuine liberation from the oppressive structures that have constrained all previous generations. This temporal Gnosticism explains the systematic destruction of cultural traditions and the endless cycle of revolutionary claims to novelty and originality. Fifth, observe the absence of genuine questioning in contemporary political discourse. Ideological consciousness already knows the answers and seeks only to implement them through the acquisition and exercise of power. The questions that animate classical political philosophy: what is justice? What constitutes the good life? How should human beings live together in community? Are either ignored entirely or answered through ideological formulas that close off further inquiry. Most importantly, Notice how contemporary political movements immunize themselves against criticism by defining opposition as evidence of moral or intellectual corruption. This creates closed systems of thought that cannot be corrected through experience because they interpret all disconfirming evidence as proof of the critic's allegiance to forces of darkness. Chapter 6: The Path of Anamnesis, Recovering Classical Political Consciousness. The crisis of consciousness that underlies our political disorder can only be addressed through what Plato called anamnesis, the recovery of fundamental experiences that have been forgotten or suppressed by the distortions of modernity. This recovery is not a matter of returning to past historical forms, which would be impossible and undesirable, but of regaining contact with permanent structures of human existence that manifest differently in each historical epoch while retaining their essential character as sources of order and meaning. Classical political consciousness begins with wonder about the fundamental questions of human existence rather than confidence in predetermined answers. What is justice? What constitutes the good life for human beings? How should persons live together in community? What is the relationship between individual fulfillment and social order? These questions cannot be answered through technical manipulation or ideological assertion but require the patient cultivation of wisdom through philosophical investigation and spiritual development that may take a lifetime to pursue properly. The classical understanding recognizes that human beings exist in a state of tension between their temporal circumstances and their orientation toward eternal truth. This tension cannot be resolved through political action but must be maintained as the essential structure of authentic human existence. Political arrangements should therefore support this tension rather than attempting to eliminate it through promised perfection or escapist withdrawal from worldly responsibilities. Aristotelian political science offers a model for this recovery that remains relevant despite the vast changes in historical circumstances since his time. Aristotle understood politics as the architectonic science, the discipline that considers how all human activities should be ordered for the sake of human flourishing, understood as the actualization of human potential rather than mere pleasure or power. But this flourishing is not a state that can be achieved once and for all through correct policies. It is a way of life that must be continuously cultivated through the practice of virtue in community with others who share the same fundamental orientation. The classical city exists for the sake of the good life, understood not as consumer satisfaction or career success but as the actualization of human potential through participation in truth, beauty, and justice. Citizens engage in political deliberation not to implement predetermined programs designed by experts, but to discover together what justice requires in particular circumstances while remaining open to transcendent standards that judge all particular arrangements. This recovery requires the cultivation of certain intellectual and spiritual capacities that have atrophied under the conditions of modernity and must be deliberately renewed through education and practice. We must learn again to distinguish between genuine knowledge and technical information, between wisdom and cleverness, between authentic authority that serves transcendent truth and mere power that serves itself, between living tradition that transmits wisdom across generations and mere convention that reflects temporary preferences. Most importantly, we must recover the capacity for transcendent experience, the recognition that human existence participates in a reality that exceeds material circumstances and cannot be reduced to biological, psychological, or sociological factors. This does not require adherence to particular religious doctrines, though it is compatible with authentic religious faith, but involves openness to the mystery of existence and humility about the limitations of human knowledge and power. The recovery of classical consciousness necessarily involves resistance to the Gnostic pressures of contemporary culture that systematically distort our understanding of human nature and political possibility. This resistance is not primarily political in the ordinary sense but spiritual, the maintenance of consciousness structures that remain open to transcendent truth despite the systematic attempt to eliminate such openness from public life through ridicule, marginalization, and legal restriction. Such resistance requires communities of persons committed to pursuing truth together rather than implementing ideological programs. And these communities must serve as schools of wisdom that form character through participation in the search for justice rather than factories that produce credentialed technicians capable of manipulating systems but incapable of thinking about fundamental questions. Chapter 7: Practical Formation of Islands of Order. The recovery of ordered consciousness cannot await large-scale political transformation, which may be generations away, but must begin immediately with the formation of what I call islands of order, communities of persons committed to maintaining authentic consciousness despite the surrounding disorder. These islands serve multiple essential functions in a disordered age. They preserve genuine knowledge for future generations when recovery becomes possible on a broader scale. They model alternative ways of living that demonstrate the continued viability of ordered existence. And they serve as sources of resistance against the totalitarian pressures of Gnostic consciousness that seek to eliminate all alternatives to ideological conformity. Islands of order form wherever persons gather around shared commitment to transcendent truth rather than ideological programs or material interests. They might emerge in families that maintain connection to traditional wisdom while adapting creatively to contemporary circumstances. Educational institutions that pursue genuine knowledge rather than credentialed expertise that serves economic and political power. Religious communities that practice authentic spirituality rather than political activism disguised as faith. Intellectual circles that engage in philosophical investigation rather than academic careerism that produces publications nobody reads. Or even businesses that serve genuine human needs rather than manufactured desires that corrupt both producers and consumers. The essential characteristic of such communities is their commitment to truth as a transcendent standard that judges human arrangements rather than a human construction that serves political purposes. This commitment manifests in certain recognizable practices that distinguish islands of order from their corrupted alternatives: patient investigation of fundamental questions rather than ideological assertion, reverence for wisdom traditions while remaining open to new insights, acceptance of mystery and transcendence rather than Gnostic claims to complete knowledge, cultivation of virtue and spiritual development as the foundation of all other activities, and resistance to the reductionist pressures of modern consciousness that deny the reality of transcendent experience. These islands necessarily exist in tension with the surrounding culture, which operates according to Gnostic principles and seeks to eliminate alternatives through various forms of pressure and coercion. They cannot completely withdraw from the larger society, as they depend on it for material sustenance and have moral obligations to serve the common good through their witness to alternative possibilities. But neither can they simply accommodate themselves to dominant cultural patterns without losing their essential character as repositories of ordered consciousness. The maintenance of islands of order requires both intellectual and spiritual discipline that must be cultivated through education and practice. Intellectually, members must be capable of distinguishing genuine knowledge from ideological manipulation, traditional wisdom from mere convention, and authentic authority from arbitrary power. They must develop skills of critical analysis that can penetrate the intellectual swindles that dominate contemporary discourse while remaining open to truth wherever it might be found. Spiritually, they must cultivate the capacity for transcendent experience while remaining engaged with temporal responsibilities. This requires practices of contemplation, study, and service that maintain the proper tension between worldly involvement and otherworldly orientation. Members must be able to participate in the surrounding culture without being corrupted by its spiritual disorder. Perhaps most importantly, islands of order must resist the temptation to become Gnostic themselves, to claim special knowledge that entitles them to political power or to attempt the implementation of perfect society through their own efforts. Their function is not to conquer the world but to maintain authentic consciousness as a permanent possibility for human beings in any historical circumstances, no matter how disordered. The multiplication of such islands offers the only realistic hope for the eventual restoration of ordered society, though this restoration may take generations or centuries to accomplish. Political reform without spiritual foundation inevitably reproduces the same patterns of disorder in new forms, as we have seen repeatedly in attempted reforms that fail because they address symptoms rather than causes. But when sufficient numbers of persons have recovered authentic consciousness, genuine political renewal becomes possible, as healthy consciousness naturally expresses itself in just institutions. This work cannot be rushed or forced through political action, as it involves the patient cultivation of wisdom and virtue over multiple generations. But it represents the only path toward genuine political recovery, as all authentic order must begin with the ordering of the soul and extend outward through the formation of communities that embody the proper relationship between temporal existence and eternal truth. Conclusion. The consciousness crisis behind every political crisis reveals itself as the fundamental challenge of our age, not a problem that can be solved through clever policies or institutional reforms, but a spiritual condition that requires patient recovery of authentic ways of experiencing reality. The deformation of modern consciousness that systematically excludes transcendent experience creates political arrangements that inevitably tend toward disorder because they lack proper foundation in the structure of human existence. Yet this recognition should not lead to despair but to hope grounded in the permanent structure of human existence itself. The capacity for authentic consciousness cannot be destroyed by any historical circumstances because it belongs to the essential nature of human beings as oriented toward transcendent truth. Even in the darkest periods of history, persons emerge who maintain connection to reality and serve as sources of renewal for their communities and future generations. Your task is not to reform the world through political action, which exceeds human power and wisdom, but to participate consciously in the reality that encompasses both temporal existence and eternal truth. As you cultivate authentic consciousness through philosophical investigation and spiritual development, you naturally become a source of order for others. The multiplication of such persons, however slowly it occurs across generations, represents the only genuine foundation for political recovery. The work begins with the recognition that political order reflects the order of the soul, and continues with the patient cultivation of ordered consciousness through participation in communities dedicated to truth rather than ideology. Live consciously in the tension between time and eternity, and you will discover that this tension, properly maintained, is the source of all authentic human flourishing and the foundation of just political arrangements.